The Red Shoes. Once upon a time there was a little girl, very pretty and delicate, but so poor that in the summertime she had to walk barefoot, and in winter she had to wear large, hard wooden clogs, so that her little feet grew quite red and sore. In the village there lived the shoemaker's old mother, and she sat down one day and made a pair of little shoes out of some old pieces of red cloth. They were clumsy enough, but they fitted the little girl fairly well, and she gave them to her. The little girl's name was Karen. It was the day of her mother's funeral when the red shoes were given to Karen. They were not at all suitable for mourning, but she had no others, and in them she walked with bare legs behind the miserable hearse. Just then a large stately carriage rolled by, and in a grand old lady. She looked at the little girl and pitied her, and so she said to the parson, "Let me have the little girl. I shall take care of her." Karen thought it was for the sake of the red shoes that the old lady had taken a fancy to her, but the old lady said they were frightful and had them burnt. Karen herself was dressed cleanly and neatly, and was taught to read and to sew, and people told her she was pretty. The mirror, however, whispered to her, "You are more than pretty. You are beautiful." It happened one day that the queen traveled through the part of the country with her little daughter, who was a princess. All the people, Karen amongst them, crowded in front of the palace. Dressed in white, the little princess stood at the window for everyone to see her. She wore neither train nor golden crown, but on her feet were pretty little morocco leather shoes that were red, and much prettier than the ones the shoemaker's mother had once made for little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared to those red shoes. Karen was now old enough to be confirmed, and she has had both a new frock and new shoes. The best shoemaker in town measured her little foot, and he did it in his own shop, where large glass cases full of neat shoes and shining boots were fixed around the room. Everything looked marvelous, but unfortunately the old lady's sight was not too good. Amongst the shoes was a pair of red shoes that were worn like the princess's. Oh, how beautiful they were! The shoemaker said they had been made for Count's daughter, but had not quite fitted her. "Are they made with patent leather?" asked the old mother. "See how they shine." "Yes, they shine beautifully," exclaimed Karen. And as the shoes fitted her, they were bought. But the old lady did not know they were red, for she was never allowed Karen to give her confirmation of red shoes. But that is what Karen did. Everybody looked at her feet, and as she walked up to the nave, to the chancel, it seemed to her that if even the sculptured figures on the monuments, with their stiff ruffs and their long black robes, were fixing their eyes on her red shoes. It was only the shoes she thought of when the bishop laid his hand on her head during the holy ceremony. The organ sent forth its deep, solemn tones, and the children's sweet voices mingled with those of the choristers, but Karen still thought of nothing but her red shoes. That afternoon, the old lady was told by her friends that Karen had worn red shoes for her confirmation, and she told Karen that she was annoyed, that red shoes were quite unsuitable, and that from now on, whenever she went to church, she would have to wear black shoes, even if they were old. Next Sunday, when dressing for church, Karen looked first at the red shoes, and then at the black ones, and then the red ones again, and put them on. It was beautifully sunshiny weather, and Karen and the old lady had walked through the cornfields. The path was rather dusty. At the church door stood an old soldier. He was leaning on crutches, and he had a wonderfully long beard, which was not quite white, but of a reddish hue. He bowed almost to the ground, and asked the old lady if she might wipe the dust off her shoes. And Karen also put her little foot forward. "Oh, what a pretty dancing shoes," said the soldier. "But mind you do not let them slip off when you dance," as he passed his hand over them. The old lady gave the soldier a halfpenny, and when he went into the church with Karen. And again, everyone looked at her red shoes, and all the carved figures too bent to gaze upon them. And when Karen knelt before the altar, she could still think of nothing but the red shoes. She forgot to join in the hymn of praise or in the Lord's Prayer. At last, all the people of the church came out, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen was just lifting her foot to follow her, and the old soldier, standing in the porch, exclaimed, "Look what pretty dancing shoes!" And Karen could not help it. She had to make a few dancing steps. And once she had begun, her legs seemed to be dancing of their own accord, just as if the shoes had received power over them. She danced around the church, and she could not stop. The coachman had to run after her. He took hold of her and lifted her to the carriage, but her feet still continued to dance, and so she kicked the old lady most cruelly. At last, only the red shoes were taken off her feet that she seemed to find peace and rest. When they arrived home, the strange shoes were put away in a cupboard, but Karen could not help going to look at them every now and then. The old lady lay ill in bed. The doctor said she could not live much longer. She certainly needed careful nursing, and who should be her nurse and constant attendant? Karen. But there was to be a grand ball in the town, and Karen was invited. But she looked at the old lady who was almost dying. She looked at the red shoes, and in the end she put them on. She thought there could be no harm in that. So she went to the ball and began to dance. But when she wanted to move to the right, the shoes bore her left. When she was going to dance up to the room, she danced down the stairs, through the streets, and the gates of town. Dance she did, and dance she must, straight through and into the dark wood. Something shone through the trees, and she thought it was the moon, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there nodding at her and repeating, "Such pretty dancing shoes." Karen got frightened and tried to pull off her shoes, but could not unclasp them. She tore off her stockings, but still the shoes stuck. They seemed to have burned to her feet. So she danced over field and meadow, in rain and sunshine, by night and day. By night was most horrible. She danced into the lonely churchyard, but the dead there did not dance. They were at rest. She wanted to sit down on the poor man's tomb where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither rest nor respite. She was dancing towards the open church. She saw an angel clad in long white robes with wings that reached from his shoulders to the ground. His face was grave and stern, and in his hand he held a broad, glittering sword. "You shall dance," he said. "Dance in your red shoes until you are pale and cold, and you shrink like a skeleton. You shall dance from door to door, and wherever proud, vain children live, you shall knock so that they may hear you and be afraid." "Have mercy," cried Karen. But she did not hear the angel's answer, for the shoes carried her to the fields along the byways. One morning she danced past a door she knew well. She heard psalms singing from within, and presently a coffin was borne out, covered with flowers. Then Karen knew that the good old lady was dead, and she felt forsaken by all mankind and accursed by the angel of God. Dance on she did, because dance she had to, even through the dark night. The shoes bore her over thorns and briars till her limbs were torn and bleeding. Away she danced over the heath and to the little solitary house. She knew that the hangman dwelt there, and she tapped on the window panes with her fingers and shouted, "Come out, come out! I cannot come in to you. I am dancing." The hangman replied, "Don't you know who I am? I cut off the heads of wicked men, and my axe is sharp and keen." "Do not cut off my head," cried Karen, "for I want to live and atone for my sins. Cut off my feet with the red shoes." And then she confessed to him all her sins, and the hangman cut off her feet with the red shoes on them. But even after this, the shoes danced away with those little feet over the fields and into the deep forest. But the hangman made some wooden feet for Karen and cut some boughs to serve as her crutches, and she went her way over the heath. "Now I've suffered enough through the red shoes," thought Karen. I will go to church and let people see me once more. But as she approached the church porch, the red shoes danced in front of her, and she was frightened and turned back. All that week she endured the keenest anguish and shed many bitter tears. But when Sunday came, she thought she had now suffered enough, and she would be just as good as the others who hold their heads high in church. And she went to the church again. But as she approached it, the red shoes danced in front of her, and in great terror she turned back and repented more deeply than ever of her sin. Then she went to the parson's home and begged that some employment might be given to her. She would work diligently and did not wish for any wages. She wanted a roof over her head and to live with good people. And the parson's wife had pity on her and took her into service. And Karen was grateful and hard working. Every evening she sat silently listening to the parson while he read the Holy Scriptures aloud. The children loved Karen. Once she heard them talk about dress and finery, and about being as beautiful as a queen, she would sadly shake her head. When Sunday came, all the parson's household went to church, and they asked her if she would not go too. But she sighed and looked upon her crutches with tears in her eyes. And she went into her own little chamber, just large enough to contain a bed and a chair, and sat down by the open window. The wind wafted the sound of the organ into the room, and she lifted up her face to heaven and prayed, God help me. Then, in the bright sunlight, God's angel stood before her, the same one who had told her that night of horror at the church porch. But his hand did not hold a sharp-edged sword. Instead, he carried a tender green bough full of roses. With it, he touched the ceiling, and immediately lifted to a great height, and the bright stars sparkled in the spot where the bough had touched it. And he touched the walls, whereupon the room widened, and Karen saw the organ, and the old monuments of the congregation, their Sunday best sitting at their pews singing. The church itself had come to the poor girl in her small chamber. She was sitting with the rest of the congregation, and they nodded to her and said, You did right to come. This is mercy, she said. And the organ played, and the children's voices in the choir mingled sweetly with it. The bright sunbeams streamed warmly through the windows upon Karen's pew. Her heart was so full of sunshine, of peace and happiness, that it broke, and her soul flew upon a sunbeam to her Father in heaven, where not a word was breathed of the red shoes.